My name is Matthew Navarro. I am a research fellow at the University of Western Australia, and I'm also the Deputy Director of Research at the UWA Centre for Environmental Economics and Policy. And this afternoon, it's my real pleasure that we have Professor Hugh Possingham joining us to talk about impact, failure, and the case for a theory of change. So before we hear from Hugh, I did want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, I want to acknowledge that our talk today is largely being organised on Whadjuk Noongar Budja in the southwest of Western Australia in Bulu in Perth. I wanted to acknowledge the First Nations people of the Whadjuk and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respects to the First Nations peoples of the various countries where you might be joining from today, including where Hugh is from, and I'll invite him to acknowledge country in his area, and also extend acknowledgement to any First Nations peoples that join us on the call. So I just wanted to also provide a bit of an introduction to ARES, what ARES is and what it's all about. So the Australasian Agriculture and Resource Economics Society is a leading institution in research on agriculture, food, environment and resource economics. It has a membership base across Australia, New Zealand and Australasia in general. And it's really designed to support the exchange of ideas. And that's something that we'll be doing today. And a lot of those ideas are about informing management of our environment and agriculture. So the Society was founded over 60 years ago and it's still going strong as an upcoming conference in 2026 in Adelaide in February. So if you are interested in joining the Society or finding out more about the conference, please feel free to visit the URL on the screen there. Very good. As part of ARES' mission to foster the exchange of ideas, the WA branch, which is us largely at the University of Western Australia in Perth, have hosted an annual environmental policy lecture over the last couple of years. And there have been some really fantastic talks. So in 2022, we heard from our own Professor David Pannell on the role of soil carbon in climate policy. In 2023, we heard from Amy Ando from the Ohio State University on systemic racism in environmental and resource economics. And then last year, we heard from Professor Michelle Voyer from the University of Wollongong on what a fair, equitable and sustainable offshore wind sector might look like for Australia and how do we achieve it. So if you are interested in viewing any of those talks, they're all available on the YouTube page with the link at the bottom there. Okay, so those are kind of all my introductions and I didn't want to take up too much time, but I did want to introduce Hugh. So Hugh Possingham, I'm really thrilled, has agreed to deliver the 2025 Environmental Policy Lecture. I personally first saw Hugh speak in 2022 in Cairns at a marine science conference, and it was at the very start of the conference and it had a real impact on me. So my career and my ambitions are really to have impact on environmental policy and ensure my research does that. And I was really impressed by the way Hugh spoke about having impact. I was also really impressed by Hugh's ability to tell a story. So, and I'm hoping there's a couple of stories that Hugh's going to share with us this afternoon. So Hugh's resume is quite mind-blowing. So he's professor in conservation science and mathematics at the University of Queensland. He's the co-chief scientist of the Biodiversity Council, the chief scientist of Accounting for Nature. He's the founding director of the ARC Centre for Environmental Decisions and the Nest Threatened Species Hub, and the vice president of BirdLife Australia. Hugh's research has included really quite impactful discoveries and tools. Probably most familiar to many of you might be MarkSan, which is a systematic conservation planning tool that's used globally to design protected areas. And this included the 2004 rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Hugh has over 740 peer-reviewed papers, more than 35 of which are in Science and Nature. And so I think you'll agree that he is an outstanding person to hear from about impact, failure, and the case for a theory of change. A little bit of housekeeping. We will try and reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions and a bit of a Q&A. If you do have any questions to ask, please type them in the Q&A section rather than the chat. And if anyone wants to go into the Q&A section, you're able to upvote questions that you want to hear asked. If your question is towards the top during the Q&A, I might call on you to get you to unmute and ask your questions verbally. So please be ready for that. And with that, I am going to hand over to Hugh to deliver our 2025 Environmental Policy Lecture. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. And let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of where I am, which is the ARE-UWA people. And I always like to reflect as an environmental scientist and somebody who's interested in conservation and biodiversity. Of course, the First Nations people here have been observing biodiversity for tens of thousands of years. They've been conserving biodiversity for tens of thousands of years and doing science on biodiversity. Now I'm going to try and share my screen while I thank Matt for that kind introduction and for organising things. I'm also glad that all these wonderful speakers you've had in the past, who I will not be as good as, I can get their talk. Now, can people see my screen? And why isn't it?
We can, it's just not full screen.
It's not full screen. Oh, how about that?
Very good, that looks good.
Very good. That's great. And it will be a bit of a storytelling device. So it's not like I'm not going to give you an undergraduate lecture. That would be insulting. I'd also note that usually when I introduce myself, I remind people that I'm a failed mathematician. My first job was in the applied maths department at the University of Adelaide, my first proper job other than postdocs. And then I'm not a very good ecologist because I don't actually I've never discovered anything in my life. All I've really done is been a very poor economist who's stolen things from people probably in this room and applied them to conservation. And people in conservation think I'm doing something interesting and useful, and they don't really realise that that's what they learned on their third lecture in first year economics. But that's my career summed up in 2 sentences. I'm going to try and tell stories about how to be useful. And I think a lot of the people on the call will be from academia, but some hopefully from government, consulting, environmental NGOs. I've worked in the environmental NGO as the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy in Washington, DC. I've been in government. I was the chief scientist of Queensland, which technically is a public service role. So I don't think I fully understand the public service, but I realise how important it is. Probably not for me. And I do a lot of consulting as well. And I'm going to try and talk about, how to get things done, I suppose. So as more background, maybe I should say that early in my career, I was interested in nature. I happened to do lots of maths because my grandmother was a mathematician, believe it or not. My mother was the first woman in South Australia to get a PhD in physics, and they said, do more maths. So I did, because we should all, lesson number 1, do what your mother and grandmother tells you. So I did all that maths, but I was very passionate about conservation. I was actually, most of my first 5 to 10 years of my career, I was interested in basic ecology questions like how do population dynamics work, how do species coexist, not applied questions. But I suppose my passion was conservation, and eventually I worked out how to get them to work together. And so I've transitioned to being much more applied. Intriguingly, when I first joined, say, the University of Queensland, people in applied areas of conservation and ecology were looked down upon. And in fact, it's been an interesting transition in environmental sciences. We've moved from a field dominated by basic scientists who are studying evolution and pure ecology and ecosystems, and more the dominant narrative in ecology in Australia has been much more applied, and that's probably a transition that's occurred in a lot of disciplines in the last 20 or 30 years. But let me begin with a few. I'm going to talk about what is a theory of change. Now, if I say theory of change to ecologists and mathematicians, 95% of them look at me blankly. I don't know how many people on this call. I think economists are more familiar with the concept of a theory of change or pathway to impact or program logic. In fact, different disciplines, engineers, economists, ecologists have made up different words for how can you show what you're doing will actually deliver an outcome. It's all fairly much common sense, but the trouble is we've wrapped all that common sense in a whole heap of jargon. In conservation, we haven't really talked about theory of change much at all, and in fact it's got us into a lot of trouble. And here are some of the wake-up calls, I suppose. Maybe the first one I'll talk about is how I start my conservation biology lectures. If you were teaching conservation biology 25 years ago, you'd talk about reserve design and you'd talk about the SLOS debate, single large or several small reserves. And so for 10 or 15 years, maybe through the late 70s and 80s, many of the world's ecologists who wanted to be useful and deliver conservation science to managers and decision makers we're discussing this issue. If all else being equal, should I have one big reserve or several small reserves? And in the end, other than the fact the answer was, it depends. The other problem was nobody was asking the question. It's not a question that managers face. And so they'd constructed a question that was so divorced from policymakers, governments, and for ENGOs, and like many areas of academia, they sort of disappeared into their own little vortex, and that was frustrating. Now, in fact, I think we're trying to be more useful, but even then, having had a lot of systematic conservation planning, Matt talked about the fact that our software Marxan has probably helped construct half the protected area systems in the entire planet, from the Amazon to the English Channel to South Africa to all the reserves in Gabon, literally over 100 countries. There are some big questions in conservation that remain unanswered and unquestioned. And one of the probably, I think, greatest papers is by Paul Ferraro and Patagnac in 2006. And in that paper in PLOS Biology, they basically said, you guys in conservation do lots of protected area construction, but nobody knows if it works. In fact, I can show you some data, some parts of the world where protected areas don't even stop habitat destruction, let alone the fact unmanaged protected areas, and this happens a lot in Australia, may be delivering very poor biodiversity outcomes relative to their previous state. So that caused an evidence revolution, and we scrabbled to gather evidence that protected areas work. And of course, in the marine world, there's now hundreds of papers, for example, 400 or 500, talking about the impact on protected areas on marine ecosystems. But there are other sort of, I hesitate to call them scandals. A lot of environmental NGOs believe that if one of the parts of delivering conservation in the real world was to get more people to love nature. So let's get all the young kids, let's say from disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have the opportunity to go camping with their parents, into the forest, and they'll all become greenies like us, because we became greenies because when we were 14 on the scout camp, we saw a scarlet robin or whatever we saw, an orchid or a flower, and suddenly we love nature. Well, they did this and they've done that for a long time. Some still do it. There is some analysis of that suggests that you take a lot of these people into the forest now, they hate it and they turned off nature because there's mosquitoes, they get cold, they can't play with their various technological devices and they get really pissed off and the food's terrible. One of the other things we love doing, so basically the theory of change was flawed, that I love doing is yelling at the Australian government. Don't we all? And we've been yelling at the Australian government for 30 years, telling them to spend more money on conservation. And we have now dozens of papers showing that if you really want to stop the biodiversity loss in Australia, if you want to stop the biodiversity crisis, federal government should up its spending from 0.1% to 1%. To be honest, I mean, the science is there, the economics is there, it's all very compelling. There's a lot of data behind it. Has it actually moved government spending on the environment? Not at all. We often think changing laws helps. Sometimes changing laws just causes panic clearing. One of my favourite ones was when a few of the big NGOs decided that we could stop steel production and therefore take steel out of the energy cycle and producing a lot of CO2 by engineered wood products. So let's use eucalypt pulp to create engineered wood products. You can actually build a skyscraper out of an engineered wood product, 50 stories high. That fixes a lot of carbon. We'll get people to plant forests and we'll wean ourselves off steel. And when I was discussing this with a couple of big global NGOs, I said, the demand for eucalypt pulp will go through the roof. Do you want to see Brazil, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria covered in Eucalyptus globulus? And that ended that plan. We make simple ecological mistakes. We kill all the cats on Macquarie Island and then the rabbits and the rats and the mice go crazy and eat everything. And then one of the fundamental mistakes we make is that we just go on gathering data and monitoring things forever, because ecologists often believe and scientists believe that you need a lot of information before you can make a decision. And so, in fact, that talk that Matt talked about when I was talking at AMSA was largely built around the fact that scientists can really hamper conservation outcomes by showing massive uncertainty and continually collecting data forever. So now I've actually contradicted myself. I've already said we needed more data to prove that the investments we make work, but then I'm saying, but don't collect too much data. So it's like all of these things, there is a happy balance in the middle, but most people do not know how much science to do and how to deliver that science to deliver impact, because almost nobody in the environmental movement, sometimes the advocacy and campaigners do know what a theory of change is. So what is a theory of change? And I'd love to know at the end. Pity we can't do one of those Mentimeter voting things, see who actually already knows all this. And this is not a complicated theory of change, but this is a typical theory of change in the environment sector. It's not very specific. We can do all the actions we can take are green. The actions deliver intermediate outcomes in yellow, or outputs, and they deliver ultimate outcomes. And there's some complexities like enabling conditions. So, and we can improve them by certain actions. So a lot of very basic ecology, and ecologists think it's all at the top of this diagram. Okay, we try different actions, different ways of, say, killing cats or removing a weed. We do more science. We work out which actions are more cost effective. Should we use the Felixer? Should we use this chemical? What should we do? And then we monitor threat states, and ideally, eventually we work out, that we have got a way of now reducing the density of cats or foxes or weeds, and we can get an outcome for threatened species. But in fact, more and more over the last 20 or 30 years, and we just ran the world's biggest conservation conference in Brisbane, and it's called a conservation biology conference, but I would say 60% wasn't biology. We're now in the bottom of the diagram, which I suppose is the social science space, the policy space, and more of the economic space. And we're struggling, of course, to start to prove that some aspects of this theory of change really work. But I think the most important thing is, when I look at recovery teams, when I talk to governments, state governments, federal governments, when I talk to NRM bodies, when I talk to NGOs, when I talk to all of those people, I realise most of them don't have a theory of change. Some of them do, and more of them are getting it. And if you don't have a theory of change, I actually worry. I worry a lot. And in the end, I'm going to talk about whether our universities have a theory of change. So hopefully the Vice-Chancellor and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor aren't listening, otherwise they're going to sack me, because in general they don't. They don't have a plan. More and more NGOs are getting them. For example, I sit on the BirdLife board, and about 4 years ago we actually built a theory of change, which is all, of course, contestable and helps focus the organisation into delivering outcomes. So I suppose that's the message number one, I think, when we're talking to ecologists, economists, social scientists. If they're doing work, and if they're just doing work because they want to make more knowledge, that's great. If they're doing work and they say they're applied and they want to deliver impact, they better be sure they can see themselves in a diagram like that, and a diagram that's specific to their circumstances. And I'm going to give you some more annoying examples. So again, in the day, in the 70s and 80s, everybody loved studying the population genetics of plants and animals, and they do things like look at the population genetics of a nationally listed species on the Kosciuszko Plateau. And I'd say, why? It's all protected. Why do you want to know that these three populations are slightly different from those two over there? Where is the theory? And there's often no explanation. It's just, this is a threatened species. If I study a threatened species, by definition, I'm doing applied science. No, you're not. One of my favourite ones, which I got a lot, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, is to help parts of the Nature Conservancy, but also a lot of other organisations, to do monitoring, design monitoring programs or modelling programs to see what would happen to species under climate change. So, for example, one group in Baja, California, they had a marine protected areas, and they said, well, we really need to know what all our species are going to do under climate change. You know, and on average, we would expect them to move towards the pole, although Baja, California may be a slightly different story. And then I said to them, yes, that would be interesting to know. We could all love to know what's going to happen under climate change with the distribution of species and the ecosystem processes. I say, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to say, oh, this fish is disappearing, and then ring up Xi Jinping or Putin and say, or Donald Trump and say, could you stop burning coal? Or you could ring up the Australian Prime Minister and tell them not to dig it up. So there was no theory of change. It was interesting to know, but invariably there's little action. And I said, why don't you study the impacts of pollution, because you could do something about that. Why don't you study the impact of overfishing, and is your marine protected area stopping people catching fish in or near the reserve? There's something. These are things you can do something about. There's other classic examples in Australia. I won't pick too much on rescuing and relocating native wildlife. Let it be said that after the big fires, more money goes into rescuing and relocating native wildlife than conservation, a lot more. There is no evidence that that delivers any outcome for conservation. Now, maybe the theory of change for these people is not about conservation. Maybe it's just about the suffering of individual animals. But in the end, I think that bottom question is the key one. If you're doing this research and writing those papers, can you explain to anybody how that staff will eventually deliver an outcome on the ground? Now, I'm going to pick on my own school of the environment at the University of Queensland. It's a big school. It's 107 people. We're just doing we're having a 5-year external review, and after some nagging from me, they didn't want to do it. They had a paragraph in 120 pages. They had one paragraph about the impact of our work. So I said, I think we could do better. So we ended up with 2 pages. We had 8 case studies of impact. It is intriguing. 4 of those impact stories are not impact stories. They're research that could deliver impact, but they're not research that has delivered impact. And that's not a bad thing. They're on the pathway to the theory of change, but they haven't actually delivered an outcome. And of course, delivering outcomes in conservation is hard and slow, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there is a massive misunderstanding in the academic world and in universities, and often even in government, about what impact actually is. Last week, a lovely gentleman called Pepe, who has been in the environmental sector for a long time, first in New South Wales and also in Pew. Some of you may know Pepe. He's been an advocacy campaigner for a long time. He gave us a talk about his 10 insights for how academic scientists could get involved more or have more impact and deliver more for advocacy. Now, I've mangled what he did, but I've taken it and changed it a bit. But it's nice that basically I have the same feelings, and I'm going to illustrate each of his points, or some of his points that I particularly like, with a story. The first one is, obviously, I think you all know that politicians, not even bureaucrats now, have time to read papers. You need to have stuff in the media, whatever it is, TikTok, Instagram, Australian Financial Review, but also stories are more compelling. So my example for this is one of the most successful science impact stories I've ever been involved in. That is, I wrote the Brigalow Declaration with Barry Trail. It was in 2003. It was based on a letter I wrote to the then Premier of the state, Peter Beattie, and the Prime Minister, John Howard, about land clearing in Queensland, which was running around 1 million hectares a year. 1 million hectares a year. I think it was up around 15% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions at that point in time. And the declaration, the statement, was very plain English. It was a page long with, you can get it on the internet in a few obscure places, with a couple of pages of citations, and a lot of people signed it. 450 scientists signed it. In the end, the interesting thing is Beattie didn't realise the science was settled. He had been told by some people in government that in fact land clearing wasn't such a problem, strangely enough. So he was glad that he had the science behind it. What was compelling mostly to the government wasn't all the data about extinctions and the data on salinity and soil loss and the impacts on the Great Barrier Reef, of which there's hundreds of papers, was the stories about how many animals were directly being killed as a consequence of land clearing. If you clear a hectare of land, you kill 20 birds. You kill maybe 30 mammals, you kill about 100 reptiles. And it's that direct killing that was very compelling to the general audience. Another thing we need to do, and was exemplified by the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef, is make sure everybody's on the same page. And this is actually a campaign led by Imogen Zethoven, with many other groups. He was with WWF at the time. And one thing they did at the start of that rezoning process, which started around about 1994, even though it didn't happen until 2004, 1998, it didn't happen until 2004, was to get all the green groups together and make sure that they were all singing from the same hymn sheet. And in fact, we had 2 or 3 meetings in our house here when there were science issues, and they all basically wrangled, and they all agreed not to do the divide and conquer, but they all agreed, and they all agreed that they would all take complete credit when the rezoning happened. And that's very, very important. Of course, more and more now, of course, those coalitions must include First Nations people. Bipartisan support is probably the most tricky thing, and it's something that I suppose most scientists certainly don't think about. Economists probably think about it more. If you can, what we see is a disappointing aspect of the environmental movement. Sometimes in Australia, they can be very left-wing, and then they only talk largely to the Greens and Labor. So, and the Democrats, when the Democrats existed. 2 pieces of legislation, 2 things that I was involved in getting up the EPBC Act. Why is that existed? Because it was created by the coalition government at the time, Howard, and in fact, Robert Hugh was the driver of the EPBC Act. Once it came in, it was almost impossible for Labor to get rid of. Now, not perfect. And arguably, it's a reasonable piece of legislation, I would say. It's just not enacted very well. But because it had bipartisan support, it was good. One of the other things we did around 2008 was similar to the Brigalow Declaration. Henry Nicks, unfortunately, who's passed away, probably one of Australia's greatest ecologists, certainly one of Australia's greatest ecologists. The current state premiers of Queensland and New South Wales were thinking of selling all the stock routes, which was roughly, in each case, around about 1 or 2% of the entire state. Are very important because they are a representative sample of ecosystem types. And again, we wrote the statement, and again, we got bipartisan support for that. And so it's gone and it's locked in, and more the stock routes, the long paddock is seen as an essential part of the conservation estate. One of the things I've been obsessed with, point number 4, has been using very, very simple economics, embarrassingly simple, called cost effectiveness, to allocate funds to threatened species. So we have a thing called the prioritisation, project prioritisation protocol. It simply looks at a whole heap of threatened species in a region or state or a country, and it ranks projects for them based on the cost effectiveness of those projects to deliver the outcome which is the benefit, which is reduced extinction rates, multiplied by the probability of success and divided by the costs. So glorified shopping, effectively. Now, when I first posed that to the federal government in 1998 in a meeting in Canberra, they said, you can't do that. That's triage. We have to work on the most highly endangered species. Your economic approach to saving the most species for the budget we have will send the community crazy. It's impossible. So this won't work. So what we did was we wrote lots of papers, gathered lots of data. New Zealand came on board. And in fact, interestingly, the meeting in New South Wales that led to Save Our Species program was a meeting where the bureaucrats who'd bought into this idea of using cost effectiveness to allocate funding to save threatened species, and of course it can be used to allocate funding to any conservation set of activities. They got me to meet the Director General, and the Director General was an economist. And I said, I think you should allocate your, $100 million a year to threatened species in this way. And he looked at me and said, haven't we always been doing this? This is obvious. And I said, no, unfortunately you haven't. So the fact we knew he was an economist, you just frame it in an economic framework, and then he obviously sells it up. And, often a lot of politicians have some form of economic or business training, and it makes sense. General public actually don't particularly like talking about this allocation approach. So you can't win through the general public. You actually have to go through straight to the decision makers. I've already talked about the Brigalow Declaration, but again, timing is critical. When I first got to Queensland 25 years ago, people said to get a slowdown on veg clearance is going to take 10 or 20 years of campaigning. But the interesting thing is that there was this narrow window of time when we think that Peter Beattie wanted some good news because there were some various things going on in his party. And the only people who know good timing politically are often the lobbyists and the advocates who are walking the halls of power continuously. So this is something I can't do. And this is why lobbyists and advocates, experts on the political processes, are absolutely critical. For us in the Biodiversity Council, it's James Trezise, and he has a network of people. And so he can say, well, Hugh, it would be good to be running a campaign on X, Y, and Z at the moment. It makes a lot of sense what you're saying, but it's just not going to work because the stars are not aligning. By all means, we should keep doing the work, but you have to wait till those stars align, and then hopefully you can get through those policy changes. One of the couple of the more interesting examples, which is really more about persistence than anything. As part of the EPBC Act, as many of you know, there is biodiversity offsetting. And in the old days, let's say early 2000, biodiversity offsetting was a bit like this. Somebody said, I want to clear 200 hectares for a housing estate in southern New South Wales. I'm going to destroy it. And the government, federal governments would say, well, could you buy another 200 hectares and add it to a national park? Now, most of you will be appalled at that version of offsetting. It basically is a recipe to destroy half of everything. And it's not offsetting. It's nowhere near no loss offsetting it. They realise that, and then they realise, maybe we should get them to buy twice as much. So they can destroy 200 hectares and then we'll have a multiplier of 2 and they have to save 400 hectares. And then people said, maybe that's not enough. Maybe it should be 4 times. We were observing this. People like Sarah Beckersey, Martine Marin, Brendan Wintle, and we think, I don't think this is very good. And so we were in our Nest pub that I was directing at the time. David Pamela, I think, was part of that Nest pub, and maybe a couple of other people on this call. And we went to the federal government. He said, we think we could do some work on biodiversity offsetting and get some improvements in your formula so that it could truly be no net lost, where, in fact, you were improving condition of degraded vegetation or you were restoring vegetation to offset the things you were destroying. And for about 3 or 4 years, they said, no, please don't do that research. It's all fine. Don't worry. Don't do it. And so they basically didn't want us to look into offsetting. And this is a case where we're often told as researchers, go to the government, ask them what their research is interested in. It's called co-design, and then do what they say. Well, yes, if that works, do it. But if it doesn't, maybe sometimes you can see that there will be a need in the future. So we did it anyway. So we just wrote papers, we thought about it. It's not particularly deep and profound. And then suddenly, I think it was around about maybe 2011, 2013, they suddenly realised their calculator was shit, and they said, we got to fix this. And they wrote emails separately to Martine, Marin and myself, and they said, would you be interested in helping us work this out? We've got 6 months to fix it. We then realised we both got the same email, got together, and we came up with the biodiversity offset calculator that the EPBC Act now uses. I think it's one of the best biodiversity offset calculators, has some innovations that hadn't been used in biodiversity offset calculators before, but not at all perfect. I think David Pannell's just reviewed it and said, some tweaks could be good, and it had some things that many state-based systems don't have that have actually been very valuable. That is, largely you have to do offsetting yourself. You can't buy your way out. Bottom line is, it's delivered huge policy impact. I would have to say that nobody like my university cares that we've delivered something that's changed multiple billions of dollars of investment or hundreds of millions of dollars investment around the country. But if we just listened to what we were told to do research on from the public service perspective, we would never have done it. Similar to the Threatened Species Index, which is now used by the Federal Treasurer Chalmers as the key indicator of biodiversity for the nation, and it's a bit in that theory of change. It's just raising public awareness about the biodiversity crisis. We used it in the Samuels Review. When we first proposed that, we were again fought tooth and nail by the Federal Public Service, and we were told you don't want to do that. Now it's their primary indicator, and the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network has taken on the task of calculating that every year and expanding it, and it's having growing impact. So I won't go through any of those other examples. One thing is you do, in some senses, have to sometimes work inside the tent, but sometimes you have to be prepared to work outside the tent. So I suppose, and maybe sometimes my relationship with governments of various levels can be tense because I do throw sticks. I am critical. If I think they're doing something badly, I'll say it. If I think it's really bad, I'll say it publicly. And sometimes I get invited onto committees and I work inside the system, and sometimes I have to go out, like New South Wales biodiversity environmental law reform reviews of 2016. They went so bad during the process that near the end I had to resign because I knew that what the reforms that were happening were going to lead to more land clearing. I made a big public statement about it. I stepped outside, and indeed I was right. Land clearing doubled once they did those law reforms because they actually changed their views mid-process. A couple of other little things. One thing is I'm involved in, many of you probably are involved in helping write submissions to government processes. Be careful. I've been involved in 100 of them, but and other forms of facile consultation. Be careful because you can drown in it and you think you're having an impact and sometimes you're not. So some of these processes are good and they're fair and they deliver big outcomes. Some of them, to be honest, are designed to waste your time. And finally, when you get really old and cranky and grumpy like me, having a memory is really bad because sometimes I'm in these meetings and I shouldn't do it. I say, we discussed this regional planning stuff 23 years ago and we told you how to do it. We told you how to plan the renewable energy infrastructure rollout with solar and wind. We told you that 15 years ago and we started developing maps of this and you wouldn't have been in a mess. You can't say that because sadly the people you're talking to actually had no involvement 15 years ago, and government and politics have no memory, and telling people you told them so apparently doesn't work. I will end and take questions. And what I want to end on is something that's sort of a bit out of scope, but it's something that has been bugging me a bit over the last year, having helped a lot of NGOs and a lot of organised governments to be clear about what is a theory of change and how they're going to deliver impact and what is useful monitoring and evaluation and research. Having helped done, I suddenly started thinking about universities because I've worked in one for almost all my life. And the University of Queensland, for example, the byline under the crest is create change. So that's our purpose, right? Create change. And then when I look at university strategy documents, and I looked at this school review, which had one paragraph in 120 pages, there was one paragraph of impact. I thought, well, okay, we want to teach people well. Half the document was about teaching well, but even teaching people well is low down in the theory of change. It's an output, maybe it's an intermediate outcome. It's certainly not an outcome. And then I started asking the heads of schools and the deans, where is our theory of change for the university? You know, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of a university? Why at the moment do we almost never value impact? I'd love to hear any stories in the chat or on Q&A. Does anybody ever patted you on the back for having impact? No, my university, sometimes the Vice-Chancellor knows because they're connected to politics. Heads of school, deans, they don't know anything about impact, and certainly they're not enthusiastic about celebrating impact. And of course, what we've done, we're drowning in, is it Goodhart's law, where we've created a lot of very easy to measure metrics like Herdic income, citations, publications, PhD completions, and they've been the surrogate of impact. And of course, they're not impact at all. They're indicators. Potentially, they may be vaguely correlated in some cases to impact, but certainly not always. And so I think there's an interesting task for those of us who are in academia, but also the people outside academia. You can ask these questions of universities and also the general public and politicians of what's the point of university. I think a university is meant to create change through two mechanisms, roughly speaking. One is to teach people really well so they then themselves go out into the world and do great things, start businesses, go into government and a wonderful public service, write musicals or write some poetry that transforms people's lives, create social change. So we're there to train left field thinking, innovative thinkers who deliver enormous outcomes for health, the economy, the environment. We should be tracking that. I don't think we ever do much. Occasionally we do. We reward people and giving talks when we hand out degrees, or we might give them an honorary doctorate, about 2 people a year. And then the other way we create change is we ourselves, as academics, do research that in theory delivers outcomes on the ground. But again, there is an enormous amount of that going on. In fact, the impact of Australian research on many aspects of the world's life, if not Australia and Australia's life, is gigantic. But it seems we don't seem to track it. We don't celebrate it. We rarely talk about it. I don't know. I don't know if anybody can tell me about how they did a promotion interview or they did their annual review, and most of the conversation, was it about the impact you've had on the world or the impact you hope to have on the world? Has anybody, head of school, talked to you about what is your theory of change to deliver the research you're doing so that it has impact on the real world? I have never had an annual review like that, but hopefully your stories are better than mine. And with that, I will end and take questions. And now I've confused everybody and asked them what's the point of their lives.
That's very uplifting. Thank you, Hugh.
I thought it was depressing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I mean, yeah, that hits too close to home in many ways. And there aren't many questions in the Q&A. There's a couple, and maybe just to kick us off, I'll ask a question that I posted. And this is kind of coming from a early career researcher perspective, or even, people doing their PhDs and things, is that you are responding to a set of academic incentives that the university imposes on you. And do you have any ideas about how we fix that so that it's more aligned with having impact? How do we document our impact?
How do we fix it? Okay.
Yeah.
So Dr. Kathleen Roderick has given me half my answer in the Q&A, because there was a process in the early 2000s, and I was also involved, and I had meetings with the Australian Research Council, and we were going to have impact stories, and I think some of you might have drafted some of them. And in theory, those stories were going to be rolled up by the ARC, and they, the Australian Research Council gathers all this income data, and that goes through the federal government, and that generates what used to be called the Research Quantum Research Infrastructure Block Grant, or whatever the federal government gives us, usually about a quarter of what we need to do the research, but it's at least something. And of course, that would create an incentive because there's an economic driver, and therefore, in theory, heads of school and deans would be more interested in those people who are having credible impact stories that went through into the system and actually generated some money. I think that all died, and I must admit I haven't thought of a better way of doing it other than the stories. I think what was possibly missing was a bit of a structure, like a program logic or a theory of change around those stories, so that even when you hadn't yet delivered impact, because much of the impact I've had, the distance between starting and getting the impact is usually somewhere between 3 and 30 years. I mean, it's a huge amount of time. So this is not a thing that favours an early career or even a mid-career researcher. And in fact, you look at some of the Ian Fraser, the HPV virus vaccine, I mean, that was 20, 30 years in the making. So you've got to be a little bit careful about rewarding impact too much, because it's just going to favour people later in their career. But I think that by using a theory of change process, we can ask those questions of academic staff and see if they can say, well, I'm doing this piece of research that at the moment looks relatively niche, but this is how I think it will eventually change policies or action on the ground or the way companies work or whatever, how agriculture functions in the wheat belt, whatever your impact story plans to be. But at the moment, I don't know, we don't seem to do that much. And the other one that they like, of course, is patents. But again, that's very much end of the story. And patents do not help with. I'm never going to patent anything. Our biggest impact story, Marxan, literally changing arguably the face of 10 to 15% of the surface of the entire planet. The only reason it's popular, largely, is because I didn't patent it and I didn't make it hard to get. So other people have made much better pieces of conservation software, including CSIRO had 2 pieces that were much better than Marxan. Ian Ball and I cobbled it together. We put it out for free. We fixed it up on the smell of an oily rag. People wrote papers about it. People used it in their PhDs. We did training courses for free. And then people like Jen McGowan and other people in our group have picked it up, and it's lived a life without any. What people have often said to me, have you ever had a business plan? And I say no, and they're appalled. I say, you should have had a business plan for Marxan. But you know, if we'd had a business plan, it wouldn't have worked. So other people, they license it, they sell it, they charge exorbitant consulting fees. It's basically a voluntary activity, because some of the people who are using it are WWF Madagascar. WWF Madagascar can't afford $100, let alone $2,000. Anyway, so I think many of the things that we do, and certainly in the social sciences and the arts, changing the way people think about topics, these are big impacts that we do need to talk about and measure, and not just the ones that get patented and make widgets or vaccines.
Cool. Okay, thank you. I might go to Yvonne Matthews. Are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thank you very much. Just following on from that previous theme, you said this path is not necessarily very useful for early career researchers, but could you give any advice for early or mid-career researcher who is looking to make impact, and what kind of path they might try to follow?
Yeah, so I did lots of things that everybody told me not to do. So I remember when I was a postdoc at ANU, so it was about 26, I did press conferences in Parliament House on forest issues. And this was about when the forest debates were really hot. You know, this is 1990. And therefore I got engaged in the political debate. I met lots of public servants. I engaged with the environmental NGO movement. And I started learning, even though I was just this pure ecologist, trying to understand coexistence in bumblebees and eucalypts, I inserted myself. So I wasn't very useful, to be blunt. I was useless. My science was useless. I got involved in the public discourse largely because the forestry industry was saying stupid things. And I countered those stupid things, and I was willing to face up to 5 TV cameras. Interestingly, half a dozen senior academics rang me up or had the courtesy to email me afterwards and tell me that I'd destroyed my career. And I shouldn't talk about these science issues in the public domain. This is 1990, remember, so 1989. So maybe there was a more conservative view. So I suppose I engaged, and that gave me some notoriety. And then one of the ways that the system tries to shut up noisy people is that they put you on committees. So I ended up being on lots of committees, and in the end I ended up chairing the Biological Diversity Advisory Council when I was just 33 years old, which was under Robert Hugh, and that helped me build connections with senior public servants. So, and I found out what they want to know. So I got under the hood of how government worked, and I listened to them, and they asked questions, and I helped them solve those problems. And again, as I've said before, sometimes they didn't want the answers I had or didn't want the suggestions I had. I probably could have been, I think I could have been more, I could have listened better, and I could have been more thoughtful, and I could have been more polite. Yeah. Turn up to meetings. Now, I think, I was enabled, but I also had to say, one of the things I like to point out is on the wheels of privilege, of which there's about 12 dimensions, I'm at the top end of every aspect of privilege that you can have. I'm not, other than being filthy rich. So white, male, cis, well-educated parents, value, I've never worried about food or shelter. So I've had a lot of freedom, and I've had a life where I've had no fear. People often say to me, Hugh, you're very brave to say that. And I'd say, no, I'm just annoying. But I've never been built so I couldn't say what I thought was the truth. And that is not true for 95, 98% of people. They fear something. They fear retribution. They fear being made fun of and all those things. So I think speak out when you can speak out. Don't let people like me tell you to shut up, and turn up to meetings, even though most of those meetings will be very boring. I've had a lot of really great research ideas listening to very long PowerPoint talks in Canberra.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Might go Peter, right? Are you there to unmute and ask your question? Maybe not. I'll just read it out. So Peter asks, are there any good examples of government conservation programs or policies that have a theory of change?
I haven't. I think the NRM bodies, I can't remember what they're either NRM bodies, CMAs, landscape boards. Anyway, those people, they seem to be, I don't want to be too pejorative about, but they seem to have much better program structured logic than the state governments and certainly the federal government do. Maybe it's because they're often dealing with on-ground action in a regionally geographically defined space, whereas the higher you go up, the policy issues become more vague and nebulous. But they do it very well, or it could be because David Pannell has taught them all how to use Infer and trained them all up. But yeah, at that level, they do really well. I mean, I think that's where the environmentally owned GOs, the ones that are very small and local, probably should get a theory of change, and often they don't because they're too small. The bigger ones at the very top end often don't have one, I think, because it's too vague and too nebulous. And people often think that policy and economic reform and all those big things you can't fit them into a theory of change, but of course you can. They're highly stochastic and unreliable, but then nature's unreliable as well. So we do often, again, defer to the gut opinion of experts, and we should question that, and we should challenge it and say, how do you see this playing out? what are all the things that happen? Maybe at a higher political level, sometimes there's too many moving parts. But yeah, the NRM bodies, I think, are outstanding.
Okay, and we probably have time for one more. We'll see how we go. It's Harvey Miller. Are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, Hugh, I was wondering, do you think that Australian universities that focus their research or try to focus their research on larger challenges will have more impact than those that simply follow the nose of their individual researchers?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And so I think I'd be schizophrenic on my answer. I'm a big fan of just giving people us. We had a very good Chancellor 25 years ago. We've had good since ones, but John Hay, and he once said to a departmental meeting, my job is to hire the very, very best people and get out of their way. Does everybody who's in academia feel as though the university is getting out of their way? No forms to fill in, no bureaucracy to deal with. No, so he said that, and I thought that's the let 1,000 flowers bloom, target the people you want and give them the time and the resources they need. The other angle is, I think large-scale directed research probably wouldn't work in a university. I think that's the job of an organisation like CSIRO. It's a different sort of task, and I think they're very successful in that space. Where I think we can do well are things like institutes, multidisciplinary institutes, and we're still struggling with institutes in the Australian university sector. The perfect ones in the environment space, I think, would need to cut across multiple faculties, and often you find schools and faculties find institutes that cut through them challenging, or challenging structures to deal with. And ideally, you assemble people with a problem, like biodiversity offsetting, or can we do restoration on mine sites? What about threatened species, or it's even more better now, environmental markets, and gather them on that problem and then let them go without really directing them much more than saying we know. Yeah, environmental markets in Australia is an exciting space to be. We haven't quite cracked it. Big opportunity. Here's some resources and some time, some money to fly around and have meetings, and some money to go to Canberra. I don't know, going to Canberra, if you're a long way, the advantage falls to the Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra people, but it's an important thing. I've been trying to get my university to help academics get to visit federal public servants as much as possible, but they're struggling to see the point. They struggle to see the point. To me, it's really, really important.
Cool. Okay. So I think that's about all we have time for. Hugh, if people have further questions or they want to follow up with you, is there a way to get in touch?
Yes, anybody can have my email. Does the chat actually work? The chat's working, isn't it? So work. Yes, I can. I don't mind anybody sending me any email day or night. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, where I've also put my phone number and my email.
It's very generous.
Maybe why I get so much spam.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I think it was really insightful, and I really enjoyed it. Can I get everyone? I guess you can't unmute, but yeah, just thank you so much on behalf of everyone, and thanks everyone for joining. And we will upload this talk onto our YouTube channel, so you can go back and view it as much as you like. But yeah, thank you so much. We might end the call there.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.